thank you for going for that for me. I hope that was fun. Right, so Bella and I are going to have a bit of a chat about some things that Bella's been studying. I think we're just going to say a bit about ourselves first. I'm Kirsty, for those who don't know me. I work for the church and I have two roles. I practice manager of the counselling service. I've been that for the last about year and a bit, and but I've been a counsellor here for quite a long time. And I also am involved in the pastoral work in the church. So that's my roles. Bella, do you want to say something about your roles?
Yeah, I also have two roles in the church. One is I'm a counsellor as well, so Kirsty is my supervisor, how do you call it? My line manager, exactly. So we work together quite closely at Hope Counselling upstairs. And I head up the student work together with my husband, Roman. So we've been doing that. It's our 4th year now doing that. And that's been a really exciting role.
Yeah. I was going to say, actually, Malcolm was part of the counselling service as well. So we got 3 counsellors on the platform. So if you need to talk, just not into the mic. So the reason for this is I know that Bella have been studying and preparing, as you often do. You love to study the Bible. And you'd been preparing something on the character of Barnabas. And it was particularly something about him. This is a series of Bridging the Gap. And this is about how does a community, how do we manage conflict well? And there's something about Barnabas that struck you. So do you want to tell me a bit about Barnabas and how he was able to uniquely kind of work in conflict?
Yeah. So Barnabas comes from the Isle of Cyprus. He was a Jew, and we don't really know how he became a Christian, but probably he came on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, heard about Jesus, and became part of the early Christian church. And the first time we meet him in the book of Acts is when he donates a large sum of money to the early Christian church in Jerusalem. He'd sold a piece of land, and he felt compelled by the Holy Spirit to give that to the church. And Barnabas was actually not his real name. Now, I'm really interested in names. I looked up what Barnabas meant. And Barnabas means son of encouragement. So his real name was Joseph, but in the early church, he had made himself a name of being somebody who was an encourager. And I think the mere fact that he gave money, probably sold his inheritance and gave that to the church, that was a big way of encouraging the church. The church in Jerusalem was growing, and there were a lot of people who didn't have money. So the Christians really looked after each other, and Barnabas was a generous man. That's the first thing that I noticed about him. And then what I loved seeing is that he's a potential spotter. So he's somebody who would see things in people, he would call them out. So for example, Barnabas introduced Paul to the church in Jerusalem. Paul had just become a Christian. He'd been a persecutor of the church for quite a while. Christians were scared of him, but he had an incredible encounter with Jesus on the road to Damascus while he was persecuting the church. And he made an absolute U-turn. Within a few weeks, he was out there preaching the gospel in the synagogues. But people didn't want anything to do with him. When he started getting persecuted and fled to Jerusalem, he wanted to be part of the community there, but the Christians in Jerusalem didn't trust him. But there was someone who trusted him, and that was Barnabas. We don't know how he'd heard about Paul or if he'd met him personally, but we know that he vouched for Paul. So he said, I trust you. And I think, it looks like he was a man that other people trusted because of his role of encouraging. So when he said, Paul's a good man, let's take him on board, then the church said, okay, let's try that. And I found that really fascinating. We've got a slide, I think, John, that's our second slide, with a passage from Acts 9. I'm not going to read it out, but just to give you a little insight in what was happening in that story. And there's 2 other stories. I could preach a whole sermon on this, but I won't. There's 2 other stories about Barnabas that really speak to me. One is that a large sum of money was sent to the suffering church in Jerusalem. There was a huge famine. There'd been a prophecy about it, and the church in Antioch that Barnabas and Paul had church planted together. They were preachers and church planters, and first Barnabas took the lead, and then later on it wasn't Barnabas and Paul anymore, but it was Paul and Barnabas. So the roles got reversed because Paul became the main missionary, and Barnabas just traveled alongside him. But there was money sent to Jerusalem, and Barnabas and Paul were the two people that took, it was probably quite a large sum of money, so he was one of the two people being trusted with that money. And then there's another one where Rupert mentioned a few weeks ago that there was a big discussion in the Church of Antioch about circumcision. So people who had become Christians who were not Jews, some people said, you need to be circumcised to be able to be part of the church. And there was a huge dispute that started in the Church of Antioch that Paul and Barnabas had planted. And Barnabas, again, was one of the people that would go to Jerusalem to have a conversation with the elders about what should we do about this question, because it really started to create a big rift in the early church. So he was a man of commitment and a man that was trusted by the early church, and I think it's because he saw potential in people. Also when things got tough, and there's a story, and there's another slide about this story from Acts 15. So Barnabas and Paul went on the first missionary journey together, and then they wanted to set out on a second journey. And Barnabas wanted to take his cousin with him, his cousin John Mark. He's the person who wrote the Gospel of Mark. So Barnabas actually influenced two really important writers in the New Testament. One was Paul and the other one was John Mark. But there was a problem there because Mark had deserted the team of missionaries during the first journey. And Paul said, I'm not taking John Mark with me. But Barnabas, who was John Mark's cousin, saw a lot of potential. Again, Barnabas is a potential spotter here. I think he saw a lot of potential in Mark, saying, yes, he made a mistake. That was not a good thing to do, but I want to give him a second chance. Paul said he's not going to get a second chance. So there was a conflict between Paul and Barnabas, and sadly it led to the two parting ways. So Paul continued with somebody else, with a man called Silas, who we know from a few stories in the book of Acts, while Barnabas went with his cousin. And I think it's interesting because then later on, when in one of his letters Paul writes and says, John Mark is useful to me. So there seems to have been some kind of reconciliation, and I'm just reading between the lines here that maybe Barnabas was again, the peacemaker here that was trying to, just to mend the rift between those two men, and Paul and John Mark were working together again. Especially when Paul was in prison, he said, bring him here because he's useful to me. So something seems to have happened, and I find that really encouraging. So, I see him as a potential spotter, see him as someone who saw the good in people, somebody who was a peacemaker, someone who trusted others, and someone that was trusted by others. So that's, in a nutshell, what I found out about him.
Yeah, that was a lovely set of detective work and seeking into Barnabas's life, and I think that's the sense of someone who sees others, who's an encourager, who's known to be this encouraging kind of person, can move towards and be in conflict, and that enables him to. It makes a safe place. I think that's what you're saying. You're a safe person. And trusted. So this brings us on to the second part. So the other thing, about Bella is the first thing you can see that she loves to study the Bible. And the other thing is, as a counselor, she loves to study. She puts me to shame. She reads constantly and consumes training courses. But you've been particularly working and moving into couple training, which was part of your original training. And you've been studying the work of John and Julie Gottman. John Gottman is a researcher and a couples therapist. Julie Gottman is a clinical psychologist, and they have produced loads of training and books and writing on couple work. And you've been studying this, and you've been looking at particularly, I will try to keep to my question, I'm ignoring it here. He's got a particular strong thing about what's the foundations for a healthy relationship, and only when these foundations are in place we can look at conflicts. Do you want to tell us a bit about what you've been learning?
Yeah, so the connection with Barnabas here really is that what the Gottmans have found out, so John Gottman he's done 40 years of research on relationships, and what he does is he invites couples into a flat that he has in Seattle. He calls it the Love Lab. And there's lots of cameras there, and then the blood gets taken and urine samples and all kinds of things. And he tries to find out by kind of in his research what makes relationships positive or what makes them negative, what makes relationship work and what doesn't. And so the connection with Barnabas is that John Gottman has found out that you can only have conflict in a positive way if the rest of your life as a couple is really positive. So he said, if you don't like each other, having conflict is really hard, basically. Yeah. So if you want to have conflict with someone, have it with someone you love. And he's found out that there are 3 main things that we can do to have solid relationships. So when it comes to conflict, we can actually move through this in a positive way. It's maybe not pleasant, but we know we can do this. And John, if you could show us, there's a slide with a house on it. Yes. So John Gottman and his wife, they have created this theory they call the Sound Relationship House, and I use that with my couples that I work with. And they say that to have conflict at all, there need to be 3 things in place that make a relationship solid. And one thing you just did in the little exercise, we call it love mapping, and it basically means really knowing the other person. So of course this is about couples work, but I'm thinking there is something in it for us as a community as well. So really knowing each other, knowing each other's ins and outs, and of course with your partner that will be a different story from somebody in the church. But I think it is a challenge to really get to know someone. And how can we get to know each other? By taking interest in people, by asking them questions, if possible, open-ended questions and not closed questions. And yeah, it's about not just staying on the surface, but going a little bit deeper. It's about remembering people. It's about remembering what matters to them, and it's about seeing when they're not okay, and asking them about it. So that would be the first one. And the second thing he found out about was that one of the 3 strengths of a solid relationship is that so partners would call out the good in each other, that they would express their appreciation, they would thank each other they would say, oh, thank you, you did that really well, for example. But it would be also admiring their character. It would be saying, oh, I admire this in you, or you look great today, or seeing anything that we see as positive. And I'm thinking of Barnabas here because he was such a potential spotter. He would see things, and I suspect that he would have also spoken about them and called them out. I think otherwise he wouldn't have been called an encourager. So speaking about each other positively, and again, that could be a challenge for us in the community. How can we spot the good things in each other? How can we learn to speak out good things? And then the third one I found really interesting. This is about, John Gottman calls it turning towards each other. And how can we turn towards each other? We can do that by listening what people are saying, and even if they make a passing comment about something, to really tune into that and say something like, oh, tell me more about it. Or turning towards I don't know, if my husband sees something outside the window and kind of points to that, and I just turn my head and say, that is actually a turning towards. So it's verbally and non-verbally showing the other person, I'm hearing you and I'm finding interesting what you're saying. So those 3 things, knowing each other, expressing fondness, And the third one is turning towards the other person, not turning away and not turning against, certainly not turning against them. Yeah, so, I've spoken about Barnabas here. Yeah, so great in romantic relationships, but really, this should be the way we talk to people in general, I think, and especially people that we see part of our community, our church family.
I do remember doing some couple training, and Gottman was part of one of the kind of theories of work that I studied, and one of the big things they kept saying all through the course was turn towards and make eye contact, and they made us go and do these exercises. I'm not going to make you do this, but where you had to go and stare at each other in the face, and I find that it's quite tricky, but it's actually very powerful. And one of the things I remember as couples that they say, when you come home and walk into the house, look at each other. I have to keep reminding myself to do this.
Yeah, actually, and kiss each other for at least 6 seconds. So
Ooh.
in our house, we're not going
to ask you to do that either. Or in private. But so it was that eye contact thing, and actually it'd be quite interesting in community just to actually take the time to look. So our next piece, so I think maybe you'll clock now that the questions that we gave you at the beginning, this is one of the Gottman exercises. They have a whole pack of cards, is that right, Bella? And
there's also an app, so if you're interested in the love mapping questions, then there's a free app that I can point you to if you're interested in.
And they suggest you just take time out, go for coffee, and just sit and ask each other these questions. I think one of them is this: what's your favourite tree, or something like that. There's some all sorts of interesting questions. But this was part of it, because we think getting to know, this is a kind of a getting to know each other exercise. And being known is really key. What we're going to ask you to do is to get into groups of maybe 4 and have a conversation about what you think. Because I think it's about how do we do this as a community. Yeah. This is about couples. How do we do this as a community? And there's the 3 things. I think there's another slide, isn't there?
Yeah, that's it.
It's the kind of, can you say the 3 things, Bella? So
the first one is knowing each other's worlds, love mapping, we call that. The second one is expressing fondness and admiration. And the third one is turning towards, so noticing when somebody else is saying or doing something.
So I'm wondering if we could get into groups and discuss in those groups those 3 things. How do you think we do this as a community? How do we build those foundations in a community? It's a bit different from building it as a couple, but how do we successfully kind of build those things into ourselves? What do you think? And so we're going to have a bit of a chat amongst us, probably, about 10 minutes, and then I'm going to ask, maybe some people can come to the mic and feedback what you've talked about in the group. So is that okay? Can we ask you to move into groups of 4 or 5, which feels comfortable to you, and look at the 3 things. How do we do this in community? And if you're online, as we've put those up, if you like, you can feed some ideas into the chat, and we can use that as part of the... So if you're on Zoom, you can do that. Sorry for the other people who are watching online. Maybe if you've got people in the house, you can chat about this. But certainly if you've got the ability to put into chat some thoughts, please feel free to do that. So do we want to...